So we're here in Prague for the Beyond Psychedelics conference, and with me is Martin A. Lee. Thanks for joining for this podcast.
Pleasure.
Now you're perhaps most famous for the book you wrote called Acid Dreams, which was a investigation into the CIA's use of psychedelic drugs to find a truth serum, and in particular the project known as, with the codename MK Ultra. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, Acid Dreams is actually a very comprehensive social history of LSD. For those who were involved with that drug, starting back in the 1960s, the counterculture that emerged, of which LSD was an important part, I really didn't have any cognizance of the fact that a decade earlier, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, was involved and very enthusiastic about LSD. They saw LSD as a key to revolutionizing the intelligence trade. And the focus initially, as you pointed out, was on the idea that LSD would be functioning like a truth serum or truth drug, an aid to interrogation. That was the initial focus of the CIA when they got involved with LSD, which, according to once classified U.S. government documents, CIA documents, started at least in 1951. We know they were already experimenting with LSD. It may have started a little earlier, but that wasn't recorded in the documents that I had access to, at least. But safe to say, it's pretty early on. That's really at the beginning of the surge of interest in LSD as a tool for studying neuroscience. At that point, LSD wasn't attached with any of the stigmas that arose in the 1960s. So it was looked upon as a very useful tool by psychiatrists, by brain scientists. The whole field of neuroscience sort of exploded with LSD being one of the key catalysts, actually. But parallel to this type of legitimate scientific inquiry, the CIA was exploring LSD for its own ends, which essentially was to gain an advantage in the espionage war. This was the Cold War now. The Soviet Union is the principal enemy, but LSD would be targeted at other individuals not part of the Soviet Union necessarily, as it turned out, as it played out later on, because it was used operationally as an interrogation aid. But initially the CIA had this naive idea, I would call it a rather naive idea, that you gave a person a drug and it was sort of like an ordinary, you put a coin in and you pull out what you're going to get. Like you put the drug in and you're going to get the information. It didn't quite work out that way, although initially the CIA was very enthusiastic about that possibility. But what typically would happen with the drug, and the CIA was looking at a multitude of different pharmaceuticals, including rejects from the pharmaceutical companies. The CIA had relationships with all the big pharmaceutical companies, and the understanding was that they would get the rejects, and they would get to look at the drugs that didn't fit into the pharmaceutical agenda. The CIA was looking at it specifically because of the side effects. That's why a pharmaceutical company would reject the drug, but that's why the CIA was interested in it. So, well, LSD was not a rejected drug from a pharmaceutical. It was developed by Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland, and it was being used experimentally. The CIA was interested in it. Typically what happened when they tested a drug and it didn't quite work out the way they hoped, they would move, put the drug aside, move on to something else. With LSD, something different happened because it was so powerful. More powerful than any mind drug known to science at the time. It was odorless, colorless, tasteless, is the kind of thing that you could surreptitiously target someone with. Rather than just say, okay, well, LSD wasn't this sort of automatic truth-inducing drug, go on to look for the next one. It kind of did a double take. It was like, okay, well, if it's not that, what is it? Because it was so powerful, so intriguing, and so compelling to the CIA. They began essentially a very intensive period of self-investigation. CIA agents themselves taking LSD to try to figure out how to use it, to try to come to terms with what it is. At the same time, they went out to outside scientists, people outside the CIA, funded their work, sometimes unknowingly. The scientists didn't know where the money was actually coming from. Sometimes they did. So there were these two tiers of experimentation, the contract studies outside with scientists who were actually really scientists, and then the in-house experimentation that the CIA was doing, which got actually pretty wild, I have to say. So.
Now, LSD wasn't the first compound that they tested. That came along later, and correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't they initially look at datura, scopolamine, and then cannabis? What were the results with these compounds and other compounds before LSD?
Well, the CIA's work was actually an extension or continuation of the CIA's World War II predecessor, the Office of Strategic Services. And the OSS also was looking initially, or really exclusively, at use of drugs as interrogation aids. And that's why the CIA was looking at it that way, because the OSS never really found what they were looking for. They did test a number of different compounds, including caffeine, scopolamine, as you pointed out. I can't remember if mescaline was part of that. It might have been, or the CIA certainly was looking at mescaline. I think it was a little bit too early. The OSS wasn't looking at that yet, although it was a part of the scientific community's discourse already, particularly in Germany. There were some very interesting research going on with mescaline before Aldous Huxley, actually going back to the 1930s.
So they weren't only looking for a truth serum, correct me if I'm wrong, but the movie Jacob's Ladder, which was partly based on your book, which follows a guy played by Tim Robbins, who's a Vietnam War veteran, who's trying to retrace his history to find out what's wrong with him, and he has like psychotic breaks, completely loses it at times. And I believe is it a fictional drug or called BZ?
It's actually a real drug called BZ.
And wasn't that used to in an attempt to create like a super soldier?
Yeah, it's it's sort of jumping ahead of the story a little bit. BZ really is the drug that came to be used in the way that the CIA and the U.S. military hoped LSD could be used. I mean, the CIA and the military were both extremely excited about LSD for the reasons we've been discussing, just the unique qualities of the drug and how potent it is. The tiniest amount would completely derange someone, particularly if that person was targeted without their knowledge. They wasn't taking it willingly or as part of a therapeutic setting. That wasn't the CIA's idea. But eventually, the CIA's whole attitude towards drug was greatly expanded. You could say the CIA's mind was expanded by LSD. And while they only used LSD on a very limited basis operationally, as far as I could tell, from the documentation I had access to in the interviews that I did, the CIA used LSD operationally as an interrogation aid, but it was really more as a torture technique. The idea wasn't, I'm going to give you this drug without you knowing and talk to you and ask you sort of clever questions and pose it in certain tricky ways and get the information. No, that didn't really work that way. But the way it did work was if they would give LSD surreptitiously to someone they were trying to elicit information from, maybe a prisoner of war or whatever, whoever the target might have been, that person would start to freak out. They'd start to hallucinate and have a full-blown, I wouldn't call it exactly a psychedelic experience, certainly a very unpleasant one if it's that, but a hallucinogenic experience. And then the CIA agents, or sometimes if it was in a military context, the US Army interrogators, would say to that person, we're going to keep you in this state forever unless you tell us what we want to know. So it was like a torture technique rather than pulling out fingernails. They were, basically going after a person's mind. With the BZ that happened later, it's a different category of drugs. BZ is a glycolate. It is a hallucinogen, but not a psychedelic, in that it's not mind manifested. The word psychedelic literally means mind manifesting. The idea is that, and this is why it's useful for therapy, that it would bring forth whatever is sort of latent in the mind. It would make the unconscious conscious. BZ doesn't work that way. It causes hallucinations, but unlike with LSD, that where a person realizes that what they're seeing is don't want to call it hallucination in a derogative sense, but it's not necessarily what's there. It's an augmentation, perhaps, or maybe it's a full-blown visions if you're closing with if you have your eyes closed. With BZ, it's a little bit different. First of all, BZ can induce auditory hallucinations,
So
which
it's more like
LSD
a delusional, maybe more like
a deliriant.
Or,
It's considered
okay, yeah.
a deliriant, a delirium-inducing drug. That's not LSD. I mean, some prohibitionists might claim that about LSD, but that's not. So the other thing is BZ lasts longer. It would last typically for 3 days. LSD typically 8 to 10 to 12 hours.
Was there any success with the use of BZ as enhancing the capacity of the soldier to perform in a battle scenario?
Well, the whole idea actually was to get the soldier to be unable to perform. It was meant to target the enemy, and BZ became a part of the U.S. Army's chemical warfare arsenal. They only had about 7 or 8 agents, chemical warfare agents, that passed through all the, jumped through all the hoops, as it were, and became standardized. That's how it's referred to, where it actually became made into a weapon. And BZ was made into, I know they had grenades and they had different, like cluster bombs and things like that, where it were BZ bombs. And the idea was that they would be used in situations where they wanted to disable or incapacitate people, but not kill them. So a scenario would be a hostage rescue operation. If Americans were held hostage by an enemy, if they could spray a gas, not a nerve gas that would kill you, but something that would knock you out temporarily, or if not simply knock you out, render you unable to resist the raiding party, as it were. And BZ was the weapon, was the drug they used to develop that niche in the chemical warfare arsenal. And it was based on the idea, the Army had this sort of highfalutin idea that LSD would usher in an era of war without death, because LSD can't kill you physically. It can harm you psychologically, depending on the situation, but it's not going to kill you physically like many other drugs. And so they had the idea on the basis of the work with LSD and the Army's own self-experimentation with LSD, not just giving it to soldiers, but scientists within the Army experimenting with it. That gave them the idea, it catalyzed the possibility, but they couldn't realize that possibility with LSD. It didn't work as an aerosol, it didn't work as a weapon that way, but it gave them the idea. So it potentiated the possibility, and then they realized the possibility by investigating a lot of other drugs and then coming up with BZ as the ideal candidate. That was featured in the film Jacob's Ladder. And it is a drug that, contrary to the war without death hype, which was used to propagandize U.S. Congress to increase the budget for the chemical weapons development. Chemical weapons were seen as, oh, that's just horrible. No one wanted to touch that in terms of, but just not good PR for any army to be involved with that. But here you have the idea, no, it's not all bad, war without death. So it sort of turned the bad PR on its head, and that's part of what it was all about. But ultimately, they actually did develop this weapon system. The problem is BZ is not a non-lethal capacity, really. Too much of it will kill you.
And there's quite a fine line between the not therapeutic dose, but the effective dose and the lethal dose, correct?
Well, yes, and the problem ultimately was they couldn't control it in the field. They did actually use this in the Vietnam War. It became part of the U.S. Army's arsenal in, I think, 1961 it was approved, certainly the early 60s, as a non-lethal incapacity. And then it was actually employed operationally during the Vietnam War, but as far as I can tell, on a very limited basis. But in the process, they were testing BZ and several derivatives of BZ. I think they had 7 of them they were looking at. The CIA also were looking at these same compounds. And some of them were even stronger than BZ. Some of them were made to act quicker. And some of them were soluble in water where BZ wasn't. They had all these different variations for these different scenarios. And they tested it on soldiers, U.S. soldiers, and the reports, they did very bizarre things. There was one report, a soldier taking a shower with his uniform on, smoking a cigar, and claiming to see flying chickens, where there weren't chickens. With BZ, unlike LSD, you see things that aren't there, and you don't see things that are there. And So it puts you in a whole other world. Unlike LSD, you're still attached to this world. It's a world for a person with a good trip, a world made more marvelous. That's not the world of BZ. It's a very bizarre world. It's a delirium is what it is.
So how is it you managed to get hold of countless documents, over 10,000 pages, according to you, of classified CIA documents?
Well, you know, when I had access to these documents, it was after the Watergate scandal in the mid-1970s. And there was a brief period, a couple of years, there was sort of an opening within the U.S. government. There was more transparency was sort of the order of the day in the wake of the Watergate scandal. Unfortunately, that was a temporary situation, and it kind of closed back up again with the vengeance. But there was a couple of years there where, as a result of Freedom of Information Act requests, that the Freedom of Information Act itself had some teeth, and it was a viable act. So I did get access to about 10,000 pages of CIA documents. I got access to about 10,000 pages in combination of U.S. Army, Air Force, Navy, FDA, U.S. Agriculture Department, other U.S. agencies that were, for one reason or another, compiling data or looking at psychedelics. I mean, much of this research was heavily focused in the 1950s. At least according to the document, the documents sort of that the CIA released tapers off after that. There's sort of limited information throughout the 60s and early 70s in terms of these drug research programs. We know that the CIA and the Army, where there was a turf war going on, but that seems to have resolved by the early 70s, where they were sharing data, particularly around these BZ derivatives. There was so it was really it was just happened to be the right moment, and I was living in Washington, D.C., and I was asked by a lawyer to examine some of these documents for his own reasons, and it led to a really fascinating look at the CIA's world. They would release these documents at a reading room the CIA had set up for reporters. Every 2 weeks they were releasing more documents, and I was really the only reporter going there every time. So I literally kind of, I don't want to say became friends with the CIA person there, but they relied on me when reporters would ask them questions about the documents. And they ended up, I don't know, I won't get anybody in trouble this long. They ended up giving me this stuff for free, copies, as a result of my being helpful. Otherwise, I'd have had to pay 10 cents a copy, and that's very pricey for a freelance writer.
When did they pull the plug on MKUltra, and what events brought that?
MKUltra started, I believe it was in April 1953. There was already CIA research into LSD. Other units of the CIA, including the Office of Security, was the main one that was looking at LSD before the unit that ran the MKUltra program, which was called the Technical Services Staff. And essentially what that was a relatively small unit to come up with support for clandestine operations, whether that was sort of fancy spy gizmos, pens that exploded or what, but any technical support. And it was seen as LSD or other drugs were going to be used in that way. They would provide that material for CIA agents to use on the missions. This program went for about 10 years. I think it wound down in 1962, but it was then succeeded by another program, and the name is escaping me of that, but it was MK, I don't remember that, it's in Acid Dreams. It's been a while for me. But there was a successor program to MKUltra, but the documentation that was released was much less extensive. I would learn that by the time that CIA turned off the spigot, when the pendulum swung back in terms of the openness started to close, that there was, what was it said, like 21 more boxes of material that they didn't release. And it would have been in the 60s, 70s up until, well, that was the time I was looking at it, starting in the late 70s. So there's a lot more information that's out there that it would be great to access it.
Now, some of your talk earlier today about the research the CIA did was really quite horrifying, like really the stuff of like a really disturbing horror movie. And they went to extreme lengths to really kind of push the limits of the human psyche. Can you describe some of these experiments and some of the perhaps more disturbing ones that seem to breach many different levels of human rights?
Actually, this was a human rights catastrophe, what they did. But sort of put yourself back in that time. And here you have the most powerful mind drug known to science. You're working for an organization that's essentially unaccountable to the general public. You can pretty much do what you want. You're not really going to get in trouble because you're working for a spy organization. They've got all kinds of cover stories and all that will protect you. And you put those two things together, plus this sort of paranoid environment of the Cold War, and you've got a recipe for disaster. And some of the kinds of things that the CIA was doing, and it's not just the most potent mind drug known to science, it's the drug that the CIA thought that's going to change their whole world, that's going to give them a decisive advantage against the Soviet Union. I mean, they were just as excited about LSD for their own purposes as Timothy Leary was excited about LSD in the 1960s with respect to his own ideas. Now, they may have been diametrically opposed, but the excitement level was very similar. So the CIA ended up financing experiments in which doctors who were involved with treating mental patients, for lack of a better term, treating people with mental illness. And back in the 1950s, some of the standard techniques were psychosurgery, that's lobotomy, actually cutting out chunks of people's brains, and electroshock. These were considered the going thing, the cutting edge thing. Now we don't look at it that way anymore, but the CIA got right into the act and started working with some of the doctors who were performing, some of the leading doctors performing lobotomies. And they got at least one doctor whose name is blanked out, but I think I know who it was. These doctors, these documents are partially redacted, but you still can know what's happening there. And it's clear that they were, this doctor was involved in giving mescaline or LSD, depending on what it was at the time that they were using, to a patient who was going to be lobotomized, give it to him before, and then have them describe the experience during the lobotomy, how it was changing. And then afterwards, they'd give him LSD or mescaline again to compare the experience before and after. So before, during, and after. This was actually going on. And also electroshock. They would give people electroshock.
Whilst on high doses of it?
While they're on mescaline or LSD. A scientist named Paul Hoke was involved in this, and he was a very prestigious scientist. All the awards, presidents of organizations. His work was funded by the U.S. Army, but he was also an asset for the CIA, and he was almost, you can look back and read this stuff almost humorously. Hoke is commenting that unlike other people reporting that LSD is something they want and they're having a good experience, none of his patients asked for it again. Why? Because it's what he was doing to people. The other thing that I found, there are a couple other examples of these sort of the gore stories where injecting LSD directly into the spine, the spinal cord, so it's intraspinal. I mean, it's enough to just IV.
What kind of doses?
Well, I don't know about the dose on that. You need such a tiny dose of LSD to begin with, 100 micrograms for a full-blown trip or a strong trip. And that's taking it orally. If you're injecting it intravenously, it's going to be immediate, and you would need less of a dose. Intraspinal is beyond that, And then there are other experiments at the Lexington Narcotics Hospital in Kentucky where they were giving, basically they're heroin addicts who came to shake their habit. It was a narcotics hospital. They were inducing these patients volunteers for these drug experiments that the CIA was conducting by giving them heroin in exchange for, rather than dollars, they were giving them drugs that they ostensibly came there to get away from that addiction. And they were keeping people, they were giving literally for 6 weeks every day increasing doses of LSD or even psilocybin. They were starting to experiment in the later 50s with psilocybin. As soon as that was synthesized by Dr. Albert Hoffman in Switzerland, and it became part of the scientific discourse, the CIA got got their own stash and were working on it. So I remember one document, 42 days straight, the scientist was boasting about how he was keeping people high on LSD. And you'd have to give phenomenal doses because it's a very high threshold tolerance where you take LSD one day, you take the same dose the next day, if you came down, you're not going to get as high. So it's
and I imagine a lot of these patients were traumatized, perhaps some never recovered.
We don't, that's a good assumption, it's a logical assumption, but we don't know really because the CIA was targeting people specifically because they were marginalized, they were weak in society, they were prisoners, people in psychiatric hospitals, people who were visiting whorehouses, people who couldn't fight back. You know, you go to a whorehouse, you get dosed, and if somehow you realize what was going on, who do you complain to at that point? You're admitting a crime, right? So it's like they specifically targeted people whose human rights were already pretty deficient in American society. And so we don't know a lot. We do know of one experiment at the hospital associated with McGill University in Canada, where the patients at that hospital who were also, there was part of a brainwashing experiment to see if they can use LSD to break down a person's mind and then to build it up in a certain way. Again, basically it was a brainwashing experiment. And it didn't work, but it surely messed up people. And there was lawsuits, I think they're still ongoing, targeting these Canadian government, US government, maybe the hospital itself, the Lane Memorial Hospital. So yes, in that sense, you have records of some people who were really hurt badly and who justifiably, some of them have gotten some compensation, but nowhere near what they deserve. But generally, we don't have those records. We do have evidence that it was rough for these people. One of these CIA guys who were involved in these experiments kept a diary, which is, you're not supposed to do that probably for security, but he had his own way of referring to CIA as stormy, quote unquote. So you could see the kind of experiences, people had really stormy, intense experiences. That was his nickname for the drug. That was his code name for it. And it wasn't peace, love. It was stormy. Indicates the kind of experiences people had.
How do you think the research into psychedelics has evolved since the MK Ultra era?
In terms of the espionage establishment or in general?
In general.
Well, I think the tragedy of the psychedelic story in terms of the scientific research is that it was truncated. It was nipped in the bud. It was terminated when so much momentum was building. It really it stopped almost entirely in the early 1960s. It kind of dribbled on a little bit, continued later on into the 70s, but very, very little. And dramatically cut back. And I think one of the reasons, when you look at what happened in the early 60s, why LSD was so dramatically cut back, and the research by the FDA. You have to remember the FDA had close ties with the CIA. They were collaborating with the CIA in its own research. By this time, 1962, it's already now over 10 years where the CIA has been very intensely focused on research with the drug, both in-house and out-of-house, and they pretty much knew what it could do and what it couldn't do. And by this time already, BZ was part of the so-called medicine chest. I mean, that's a weird way to refer to it, but part of the CIA's, literally the CIA and the Army's arsenal. In the case of the Army, it was literally part of the military arsenal. So the LSD was less important to them by 62. I suggest that if the CIA wanted the research to continue, it would have. The fact of the matter is they had no need for it anymore. They knew what they could and couldn't do. They kind of came to terms with how they could use it in a limited way. They started to understand some things about set and setting, so that it wasn't just about the drug, it was about the setting in which one took and the way, the attitude one has in taking the drug. Well, if you don't know you're getting a drug, which is how the CIA and the Army were administering it to people, and if you're in a very hostile environment and you're being interrogated by your enemy, clearly you're not going to have a very positive experience. It took the CIA a while and the Army a while to figure that out. They had a very, you might say, a sort of square idea about what you do with drugs. And that changed as a result of their encounter with LSD. It really, hundreds of think of it as going on sort of this one track with focusing on interrogation and maybe also as a discrediting agent. But that was pretty much it. When they first encountered LSD, about 18 months after first encountering it, it's like everything you can imagine to do with the drug, the CIA was thinking about it. And I attribute that in part to how, in some sense, the CIA's own mind became more creative with respect to drugs as a result of their own encounter with LSD. That's what I think happened. It's a kind of ironic, more creative in the wrong way, but definitely and again, certainly it created a great sense of possibility, a grandiose sense of possibility of what they could do with LSD, which seems to be very common.
The modern psychedelic experiments have really become a lot more transparent, and there's a lot more regulation involved than in the days of MKUltra.
Well, MKUltra was totally unregulated because it was secret. And I think a lot of the research now is sort of picking up where things left off when the CIA decided they were no longer interested and the FDA decided to pull back on the research. I'm not saying that's cause and effect, but I think it's coincidental in a way that's not simply coincidence, if you know what I mean. So I think a lot of what we're seeing today with psychedelic research, and it's really gratifying to see this renaissance, both in the scientific field and socially, that there is a renaissance. Many of the same themes, the same areas of focus are being continued today. But now the whole area of neuroscience is advanced, so that whereas in 1962 they could say this has potential for alcoholism or autism or depression or any number of mood disorders that are now being looked at again today, end-of-life anxiety, things like that, with really very exciting and promising results. But now the understanding in terms of neuroscience is so much more advanced, where we could say, no, well, psilocybin and LSD and ketamine, these other drugs are actually neurogenic. They actually can produce or engender the growth of new brain cells in adult mammals. That was inconceivable back in the 60s. First of all, scientists didn't understand that adult brains could grow new cells. They didn't have that understanding as we do now. And they certainly didn't have the understanding that LSD was involved as a neurogenic agent, as is cannabis, by the way. It's interesting that these drugs have that effect. And that's one reason why they're antidepressant. If you're producing new brain cells, that has an antidepressant effect. I think it goes beyond that. I think the reason why LSD and psilocybin could have a long-lasting antidepressant effect probably goes beyond just that physiological factor. But certainly, that's very compelling. Not many drugs do that.
And how do you think psychedelics could be integrated into mainstream society for serving a purpose of raising humanity's awareness, perhaps for a sustainable future for the planet?
It's an evocative idea. It's an idea that many people who have been smitten by psychedelic drugs in a positive way share or embrace. Aldous Huxley articulated that in the novel Island. But if you remember in that book, in Island, it kind of goes awry because the real world, so to speak, kind of interferes. The geopolitical situation, it destroys this utopia, the island, in which psychedelics were part of the educational, part of growing up, part of education. Psychedelics were once mainstream in shamanistic societies, you might say, and in societies that were maybe pre-agricultural societies. For most of humankind, psychedelics were not something that people on the margins used. It was totally integrated, a vision quest or whatever. So when we talk about integrating into mainstream society, it's pretty tricky because, okay, think about that. How will it not end up like Huxley in the novel? Because I don't want to be a naysayer, or be a downer, or be pessimist. I think certainly it should be integrated educationally into our culture. It's very important, but unless the culture as a whole changes, unless the socioeconomic system changes, I think there's kind of an inherent clash there.
So perhaps psychedelics are not the catalyst required for that shift in the socio-economic paradigm.
Maybe they're the catalyst, but I don't think they're necessarily the key to implementing the changes that the catalysts call forth. I think the psychedelics can give us a vision of a better society and also a better life for individuals, a more integrated. These experiences are profoundly healing. It can be, but I think the challenge, both individually and socially, is what happens next. What do you do? It's not just information. What do you do with that experience? If you've seen the light, how do you deal in a society that's so overcome by darkness now? How do you relate to that? And there's many things. One could be a better person, of course, more generous in a spiritual way. And hopefully, I do think that is one of the aspects of potentially the good aspects of psychedelic experience. More respect for nature. I think that's been shown by some scientific work recently, that people who have psychedelic experiences tend to be more ecologically sensitive, maybe ecologically aware. It doesn't mean without that experience you can't be green, but certainly it seems that a disproportionate number of people who are involved with psychedelics also have a kind of a green consciousness. But I think very important as catalysts, but not necessarily the key to implementing what the catalyst inspires. I think that's my sense of it. I think it's going to take a lot, to go forward.
This conference has covered pretty much every psychedelic across the board. Which one in particular do you see the most promise?
Well, I have my biases toward plants in general, but I have to say, LSD is pretty effective and very effective. And in some ways, it's easier. You can just manufacture it with the plant. You can make it for millions and billions of people, literally, if you had the wherewithal. Could you do that with psilocybin? No, not really. I mean, you'd wipe out all the mushrooms. You couldn't really wipe out all of them, but I'm saying you need to. So I think I don't see a future without LSD in this context. I think it will be a prominent part of it. I think it should be too. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that these all stem from plants or fungi initially, with the compounds in what becomes LSD. I think there are differences in these experiences. The ayahuasca experience, the toad medicine, if people have been talking about it, that can be real bizarre. I think there's similarities with hallucinogenic or psychedelics, but and there are psychedelics that aren't hallucinogenic, like MDMA, like ecstasy, meaning bringing forth what's in the unconscious. That's the true word meaning of psychedelic. But I think there's a limited number of these plants. They should all be looked at. The CIA pretty much looked at all of them they knew about. They were after anything. They sent literally people on expeditions to South America, which is a great source of hallucinogenic plants, and to the Caribbean, to other parts of the world, even to Europe, looking for the old witches' psychedelics. Is it really true about henbane and this kind of thing? The CIA was really obsessed with this stuff in the 1950s. So. All good. We should have a variety of options. I think that's probably better. Some people might do better on MDMA rather than LSD, or might do better on psilocybin rather than ayahuasca. And those drugs, the plant drugs, are used in a ceremonial context, and we need to respect that. And I think part of their power and their effectiveness is very much tied into that context. When you remove a person from that setting, setting is so key. You change the experience somewhat, and you may lose something that's very valuable, and it may be a little more dangerous in the sense of psychologically dangerous when you pull someone out of that ritual context. We're a culture where we've lost the connection with these rituals, and part of this conference has been emphasizing rituals.
Reconnecting.
Yeah, and that's it's something. A drug can be a focal point of that, but that's that loss of a connection to that kind of ritual is something that speaks to a much bigger problem with humanity right now, which I'm not sure if any drug can solve that problem. But I think the psychedelics, unique among drugs and pharmaceuticals, can really shine a light on the problem and point the way, even if it's not the way, because you can't take LSD all the time. You can't take, and these things I think are being meant to use, at least for me personally. I don't judge other people really, but very special occasions, and that's how it was initially. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And we've lost that wisdom in the culture. When we talk about integrating, wow, it's a big challenge because the culture is pretty onerous at this point, Western society.
And how important do you think it is to integrate psychedelics into mainstream psychiatry and psychology?
I think it would be great. I think that it came, in terms of its mainstream, it came to us in that context. It didn't start in the 1960s. There was a whole decade before that of scientists and psychologists and psychotherapists working with it and making some really interesting discoveries and interesting strides. And again, unfortunately, it got kind of cut off and nipped in the bud, as it were. But so I think the medical aspect, if you will, as long as medicine doesn't only apply, medicine in the American Indian sense, it doesn't only apply to sick people, because we're all sick to some degree, you could say. We're all out of balance with the cosmos to some degree, but not sick in an acute disease, send me to the hospital sense. Psychedelics definitely are a useful tool for not just the seriously ill or about to die, but for even the so-called healthy. And that's something that's a real challenge to the mainstream way of looking at things. And and I think ultimately it's bound to be accepted in that way. But the medical use also, or the therapeutic use, is just partial use. I doubt that at this conference you'll find, I'd be surprised if you find anyone, but if you did find anybody, it'd be very few who were introduced to psychedelics in a therapy, in a strict therapeutic session. Most people got introduced either just by doing it,
or a party or somewhere like that, festival.
Or just, hey, they're interested and they got some. They did it with a friend who had done it before, and that's fine. You can have very profound therapeutic, mystical experiences in that context. Not necessarily, but you don't necessarily have those experiences in a therapeutic context. So I think it's one. I think strategically emphasizing the medical aspect of psychedelics just is a good strategy, a viable strategy, and I think ultimately it will be a successful strategy, just as it has been for cannabis. It's a good model to look at, certainly in the United States, maybe not so much in the UK right now, but in other countries. The medical cannabis is now accepted, maybe somewhat begrudgingly by the powers that be, but it's now legal, and it's really proving to be very valuable for people. And I think the success of that approach is something that the psychedelic activists, as it were, or advocates, I think should look at very carefully, because this is it's not just a matter of dropping acid and saying, hey, this is great anymore. We are dealing in a situation where society is ready in certain ways. I mean, in the United States, they're desperate for something to help their soldiers. Nothing's helping. These people that come back from wars that are really screwed up because of PTSD or brain injuries, things like that, they're so desperate that they're willing to listen to people like Rick Doblin and willing to consider ecstasy and probably eventually even psilocybin and something like that. So it's the right time. There's a general sense of we're going through dark times now politically, with the racism and the anti-immigrant and the radical right populist movements on the rise as they are. And it's very, very disturbing. But we should also remember or keep in mind, back in the 1930s, there were fascist ideologues who were experimenting with mescaline, and they didn't lose their fascist ideology. And so we got to keep in mind, this is not an automatic thing.
If we look further back through history, the leader of the Aztecs he used huge amounts of magic mushrooms to communicate with the war god, and then he literally cut out people's hearts, like more than 1,000 in a day.
Now that was a cultural, that you look at that, and we can look at that being horrified, and it is pretty bizarre. But culturally, that was accepted within that society. But those compounds, those plants, didn't. I mean, the culture sort of informed the use of those plants in that context. It wasn't so much the other way around, and we're thinking of using it on the psychiatrist's couch. Well, that's our culture informing the experience, or shaping the experience. I'm not saying that's bad, but we need to keep in mind that these compounds are always used in a cultural context. The white light might be the white light. It might be cross-cultural, transpersonal, everything like that. But the context of all this is inevitably embedded in a cultural environment. And our cultures are far from perfect, as we know. And will psychedelics change culture? Yeah, it will affect it. Just the incremental. Every person that goes through this experience can be changed in some way. Many people in a positive way. But honestly, I feel it's a little bit. I'm disappointed in some ways when a few people have raised questions about, well, how is this going to affect the larger world? And 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. Eventually leads to a whatever, but we had millions of people turning on in the 60s, and now we have Trump in the U.S. So maybe we'll have hopefully a strong reaction against that.
Maybe it's going to come in cycles again.
Yeah, I just think we should learn a lesson from the CIA, if you will, and the U.S. Army, because what they did, they made the classical mistake of misinterpreting what the drug was and defining it in ways that were a projection of their own experience. So the CIA, they didn't define it as a peace love drug, they defined it as an anxiety-producing agent. That's how they looked at LSD. Of course it was. If you're taking LSD without you knowing you're going to get it in this completely paranoid environment, who wouldn't be anxious?
They initially thought that it simulated
madness,
schizophrenia.
Yeah. Well, that was the going thing in the scientific community. The non-CIA scientists also were looking at this as a drug that will make a normal person temporarily schizophrenic, and this gave rise to a whole host of ideas. Well, if they can come up with a drug that could negate or counteract that artificial schizophrenia, maybe it would work for a real schizophrenia. What they came up with was Thorazine, which is a pretty nasty drug, and then became widely used in mental health, in psychiatric institutions. Thorazine, more to kind of sort of straitjacket a person.
Yeah. I think they call that in the UK. They dub that liquid kosh.
Oh God, yeah. This shows that in some ways these experiments that were going on did actually have an impact in the scientific milieu, and that what the CIA and the scientists that they were working came up with as an antidote for LSD psychosis became utilized widely in the psychiatric field. Not so much anymore, I don't think. I hope not. It's a pretty nasty drug.
I guess it made people more manageable.
Yeah, that was the key thing. But I think really the lesson I draw from it is that we have to be careful about assuming, because we have certain types of experiences, that everybody will have them, or everybody even could have them. It just doesn't work out that way. If you're a Nazi fascist and you take LSD, you're probably going to be a Nazi fascist after the trip. I mean, that was the case for Julius Evola, who was a guru of Italian neo-fascist terrorism, who, according to the people I interviewed, he took mescaline during the interwar year, between World War I and World War II. He considered himself very avant-garde.
I'd like to know what setting he did it in.
I don't know, but he wrote books about chakras and Eastern mysticism, and another example would be meditation. People talk about meditation as that's going to. First of all, I think meditation is excellent. It's a really healthy thing to do. But the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi that turned the Beatles on to meditation, he was a supporter of the Hindu Nationalist Party. They're fascists. They're the ones that go on pilgrims and kill the Muslims. So just because you're a guru or a meditator doesn't mean you've got good ideas about the world. We need to kind of extract ourselves from that romantic idea
They're probably the ones we've got to watch out more for, right?
Yeah. You know, again, I'm not putting down people that do transcendental meditation. I'm sure it can help people. I did it at one point in my life, but it's I tried it, and it was interesting. You know, it was a good thing. It's just that these consciousness altering these techniques, whether it's meditation or a chemical compound, they're very tricky, and that there are LSD and so it's so powerful. It leaves you with such an impression. It can inspire such visions of what's possible, but it's also that there's a temptation there. That temptation, it kind of can suck a person in to think, well, if everybody took LSD, we'd stop war. Well, if everybody took LSD, first of all, everybody's not going to take LSD, and if everybody did, no, you wouldn't necessarily stop war. You'd have a lot of people who take LSD, and I think one has to be careful about over-romanticizing.
Yeah, a friend of mine, James Orrock, perhaps you know him, he wrote a book called Tryptamine Palace, focusing on 5-MeO-DMT, and he's got a theory that psychedelics, they dissolve the ego, so they break it down, but like with bodybuilders and muscle growth, it grows back, the ego grows back stronger.
It's an interesting theory, because I think the way we talk about these things, ego and dissolves the ego, I'm not entirely comfortable with it, because you need an ego to get along, get in the world. That doesn't mean you have to be a jerk.
But at the same time, it can make us suffer.
Oh yeah, no, there's no doubt. But I mean, it's not. I mean, what is the ego really? Is it the ego, the id, and the ego? Is it like Freud was talking about it, or is it like the philosophers, the phenomenologists were talking about it? You're transcending the ego. But we have a sense of that we're in the world in a certain way. We relate to the world as us and the world. And that if you can change that relationship, even temporarily, that can be very invigorating and illuminating. But yeah, I think we got to be careful about the idea it dissolves the ego. Well, if it really dissolves the ego, why does it then come back after the trip? If it's gone,
or perhaps it comes back, but it's recalibrated.
I mean, I think it could. Certainly, there's potential there. We know it without a doubt that it can help a person's. Improve their experience of their own self, their own selfhood in the world. And it's ironic that an experience that at the peak the self dissolves would improve your how you are in the world, how that self is. But it's, again, one of the ironies of the nuances of the whole thing. So, yeah, I think it's an interesting, what you just mentioned, is that the toad medicine? Yeah, that's really strong stuff. And I'd be curious to look at that book. I don't know. You know, I see people who take LSD and afterwards they seem to be total egotistical assholes. So maybe there's something to it. And then again, others, people take LSD, they really do become, move in the Mother Teresa direction, more giving, more selfless, if you will.
So perhaps a final question and then we'll round it up. So there's a lot of mention of ego dissolution and the fact that psychedelics seem to create much more connections between different brain regions and allow you to see from a different angle and approach your like problems, etc. Through different filter, like without the filter, which allows for healing. What is the main features of psychedelics which you see as benefit on a personal level?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think part of this, it is a sort of a dose dependent. The stronger the dose, the more likely you get to the point of a...
So you're not so much for microdosing then?
Well, no, I think, back in the day, no one heard of microdosing. It was all about macrodosing. Microdosing is very intriguing to me. I've not done that. I've not done psychedelics in a long time. I had my period with it. I tried quite a few different things. And very important to me personally. It really affected my life, I'd say, in a positive way. My last LSD trip, I'm still trying to integrate, but in a good way. It was a very... remind me of the question again here.
What are the main benefits that you seek from the psychedelic experience?
I had what would be called, I think, a visionary experience by some people, and no highfalutin, unitary experience. I don't know, visionary, unitary. Bill Richards just gave that kind of hierarchy of things. All I know, it was very profound, and I really, something came together for me about healing and about living in a way that I had never saw it that way before, or maybe I was about to see it and it just put it all together. And my last trip with LSD was in 1980, so a long time ago. I've done some other things since then, but that last experience was certainly the most, every one of my experiences with LSD were profound, but this was the one that really, you know, like they say, if you get the message, you can hang up the phone. I've never felt an urge or an interest to do it again. I've never made a decision not to do it again, but I was like, well, nothing could top that, you know. So for me personally, it does have a lot to do with healing, and it has shaped my path in life for sure. Just understanding things. I found LSD to be inspiring on a philosophical level. And even what some people consider the most facile aspect of it, just you see these incredibly beautiful visions that are spinning so fast and they're impossible to stop. And, you know, you can't remember it because it's so beautiful, and it's whatever it was next, it's the other thing. It is just, you know, anyone who's had that experience knows what I'm talking about. And some people say, well, that's just the pretty stuff. It's not the real deal. But I think that's really interesting to be confronted with those kind of visions, to be immersed in those kind of visions, to be one with them. Not, when I mean those visions, the kind of kaleidoscopic visions. I'm not talking about a moment of vision. It's a little different. Because it presents all sorts of interesting issues about philosophy, about temporality, about change, very Buddhist, that everything is all changing all the time. Well, just drop some acid and that'll hit you really hard, first noble truth of, all the noble truths of Buddhism. You will experience them not reading a book, you'll experience them in your blood, in your breath, in your brain, in your body. You know, you experience things more than rationally. It's your toes are learning it, not just your head. You know, that was my feeling about it. So, yeah, I think these things are tremendously important. I don't think their value lies only in a therapeutic setting, although I think that's the best way to go in terms of a strategic effort to reintegrate these into our experience. And yeah, I think that's it's my take.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Very welcome.